I never understood what love looked like, not in the way most people described it. Growing up, I'd hear classmates talk about their parents with a fondness that felt foreign to me. A warmth that filled up the space between their words. It seemed like they were tethered to something solid, something that would always catch them if they stumbled. But in my house, love was a vague and shifting concept. Something I understood in theory but never quite experienced firsthand. Looking back, I can hardly remember a single birthday that felt special. Maybe it was because we didn't have a lot of money. Or maybe it was something else. Something deeper. My parents would buy a small cake, set it on the table without candles, and stand on either side of me as I blew out a non-existent flame. The whole scene felt like a performance we were all obliged to carry out. A formality rather than a celebration. No laughter, no joy, just the three of us standing around a cake. Me wishing for something I couldn't quite name. That feeling of something missing followed me everywhere. When I brought home school projects or report cards, my mother would nod in acknowledgement, but her eyes always seemed elsewhere, as if she had 100 more pressing matters on her mind. My father was even harder to read. He was either out working or at home, quietly reading, as if our lives barely overlapped. I became accustomed to being unnoticed, like a piece of furniture in the background. It hurt, though I was too young to know how deeply it would affect me. In my early teenage years, I started noticing the way my parents talked about other people. If one of my classmates made it onto an honor roll or won a sports championship, they would shrug and say something like, "They probably got it easy," or, "Must be nice to have connections." There was always this edge to their words, a subtle bitterness that colored their view of the world. I learned not to tell them about my dreams, my ambitions, or even my small successes. I knew by then they would be met with indifference or skepticism. Maybe even a backhanded comment that would make me wish I'd never brought it up. But there was one particular day that stands out to me. Even now, it was the day I finally truly understood that I would never have the kind of relationship with my parents that other kids seem to have. I was 15, and I had spent weeks working on a history project that I was especially proud of. I'd stayed up late researching, putting together a presentation that felt like an accomplishment. When I got my grade back, a perfect score, something rare in that teacher's class, I remember walking home with a mix of pride and nerves, hoping my parents might see this as a sign that I was doing something right. That evening, I waited until dinner, hoping to share the news. When I finally gathered the courage to tell them, my mother barely looked up from her plate. My father, after a long pause, said something I'll never forget. "That's nice. But you know, in the real world, grades don't mean much. You're going to need more than school smarts if you want to make it out there." It was like the floor had disappeared beneath me. In that one moment, all the pride I'd felt evaporated, replaced by a hollow, sinking feeling that I would carry with me for years. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the beginning of the wall I started building between myself and my family. One cold brick at a time. I didn't want to be hurt like that again, so I stopped trying to reach out, stopped hoping for something I would never receive. I buried my ambitions and achievements, kept them close, protected like delicate things that might break under too much scrutiny. And so I learned to live in my own world, a world where achievements and milestones were personal, private things. By the time I reached high school, I'd grown adept at keeping secrets from my parents, not out of rebellion but out of self-preservation. I knew they wouldn't understand my dreams, and I knew they wouldn't support them. It was a lonely existence, but at least I was safe from disappointment. It wasn't until college that I found something to pour my heart into. A passion that felt like an extension of myself. It was a hobby at first, something I stumbled upon by chance but couldn't let go of. Every hour I spent on it felt like reclaiming a part of myself I didn't even know was missing. The more I threw myself into it, the more I began to feel a glimmer of something I'd only heard about, a sense of purpose, of pride that didn't need anyone's validation but my own. And so, in the quiet hours between classes and work, I began to build something of my own. I didn't tell my parents, of course. I knew they'd dismiss it as a waste of time or a distraction. But this small project of mine became a lifeline, a spark that kept me going when everything else felt bleak. I started to imagine a future where I could make a living doing what I loved. A future where I didn't need anyone's approval to feel like I was enough. For the first time, I began to see a path that led somewhere other than the shadow of my parents' indifference. I didn't know how far this path would take me, but for once, I was determined to find out on my own terms. And as I took my first steps down that road, I felt something close to hope, a small, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, I could build a life worth living without their love. College was an unexpected reprieve. For the first time, I was away from home, surrounded by people who had no preconceived notions of who I was or wasn't supposed to be. It was liberating in a quiet, understated way. The anonymity allowed me to test new boundaries and explore parts of myself that had always felt stifled. I was still cautious, always wary of drawing too much attention to myself or my ambitions. But I felt a small flame growing inside me, the beginnings of something I hadn't felt before: independence. I started working part-time at a bookstore near campus. The hours were long, and the pay barely covered my basic expenses. But the store had an atmosphere that I grew to love. The shelves lined with worn paperbacks and the quiet murmur of readers made the place feel almost sacred. I loved every minute of it: the smell of old pages, the camaraderie with my fellow bookish co-workers, the customers who would come in looking for something to inspire them. It was here, among those shelves, that I stumbled upon a world that would change everything for me. It started innocuously enough. One slow afternoon, I found myself flipping through a book on craft and design. I was fascinated by the intricate details, the artistry behind each piece, the way every project was infused with a personal touch. Before I knew it, I'd devoured every book on crafting, design, and creation that the store had in stock. Something about the process resonated with me on a deep level. It was about taking raw materials and shaping them into something beautiful, something meaningful. In a strange way, it felt like a metaphor for the life I wanted to build, one that was shaped by my own hands, created from the remnants of what I'd been given. I started experimenting with my own small projects in my dorm room, staying up late into the night to work on pieces that I had no intention of showing anyone. At first, I stuck to basic things: simple jewelry, hand-painted cards, little trinkets that served no real purpose other than to make me feel alive. But over time, I grew more ambitious. My designs became more intricate, more thoughtful. I spent whatever spare money I had on supplies, combing through thrift stores and online marketplaces for materials that sparked my imagination. My room slowly transformed into a small workshop, every surface covered in paints, tools, and materials. It was messy and chaotic, but it felt like home in a way my real home never had. Eventually, I made enough pieces to consider selling them. I was nervous, terrified, even, but there was a part of me that felt compelled to try. I opened an online shop, snapping photos of my creations and carefully crafting descriptions. I remember clicking publish with my heart racing, wondering if anyone would even notice. At first, nothing happened. Days passed, and the shop sat silent, the digital equivalent of an empty storefront. But then, slowly, things began to change. My first sale came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was working at the bookstore when I got the notification on my phone. Someone, a stranger halfway across the country, had bought one of my pieces. I stared at the screen in disbelief, half expecting it to be a mistake. But it wasn't. Someone had seen value in something I'd made, something I'd poured my heart into. It was a small sale, barely enough to cover the cost of materials, but it felt monumental. I went back to my dorm that night, glowing with a sense of pride and possibility that I'd never experienced before. Over the next few months, the sales began to trickle in more regularly. Each one felt like a small victory, a quiet affirmation that I was doing something worthwhile. I would pack each order with care, including a handwritten note to thank the buyer. Every time I shipped out a package, I felt like I was sending a piece of myself into the world. Little fragments of my story finding their way into the lives of strangers. I was careful with my earnings, reinvesting whatever I made back into the business, buying better materials, and expanding my inventory. Slowly but surely, my little venture began to grow. It wasn't long before my parents took notice. They didn't know the details of what I was doing. Of course, I'd kept that part of my life carefully hidden. But they started noticing the small, barely perceptible changes in me. I wasn't asking for money as often, and I wasn't calling home as much. The distance between us had grown even wider, and I could sense the disapproval, though they never voiced it outright. I think, in their minds, they expected me to follow a more traditional path, one that would lead to a stable job, a predictable paycheck, and a quiet, unobtrusive life, the life they had always envisioned for me. I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface whenever I did speak to them. My mother would ask vague questions about my plans, hinting that I should be focusing on real, career goals rather than hobbies. My father would occasionally slip in remarks about the importance of financial stability and job security. They thought they were being subtle, but I could hear the undertone of disapproval in every word. To them, this was just a phase, a distraction that would eventually lose its appeal. I didn't argue with them. I'd long since learned the futility of trying to explain myself. Instead, I nodded, kept my answers short, and returned to my work with even more determination. As the business continued to grow, so did my confidence. I started attending craft fairs and local markets, setting up a small booth where I could interact with customers face to face. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People admired my work, asked thoughtful questions, and even came back to purchase more. For the first time, I felt a sense of community, a feeling of belonging that I'd never known. I was building something that was entirely my own, something that didn't rely on anyone else's approval or validation. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. But I knew, deep down, that I was on the right path. But as my business flourished, my parents' interest grew increasingly sharp. They began to ask more direct questions, prying into the details of my finances, my plans, my future. I tried to deflect, giving vague answers that wouldn't invite further inquiry, but it became harder and harder to keep them at arm's length. I could sense their frustration building, a mixture of confusion and resentment that I couldn't quite understand. It was as if they resented my independence, my ability to build something without their involvement or guidance. The more I succeeded, the more they seemed to view me as a stranger, someone they couldn't quite control or understand. And as their interest in my business grew, so did a feeling of unease, a nagging suspicion that they weren't asking out of genuine curiosity or support. There was something else there, something darker, lurking beneath the surface. It was a strange realization, one that left me feeling unsettled. I'd spent my entire life craving their love, their approval, but now that I was finally carving out a life of my own, their attention felt more like a threat than a blessing. I didn't know what they wanted from me, but I could feel them circling, watching, waiting, and as much as I tried to ignore it, to focus on the success I was building, I couldn't shake the sense that something was about to change, something that would force me to confront the very thing I'd spent my life running from. And so, as my business grew, so did the distance between me and my parents, a widening chasm filled with unspoken words and lingering resentment. I could feel the tension tightening, like a rope being pulled taut, waiting to snap. And in the quiet moments, as I worked alone in my little room, I wondered how much longer I could keep them at bay, how much longer I could protect the life I was building from the shadows of the life I'd left behind. There's a strange thing that happens when you start to succeed, especially when you're used to a life of being overlooked and underestimated. It's as if each small victory sheds a little bit of the weight you've been carrying. Each step forward a quiet rebellion against everything you've been told about yourself. My business became that rebellion. With every new order, every happy customer, and every late night spent perfecting my craft, I felt myself becoming something more than the invisible child my parents had known. As my business grew, so did my confidence. My life took on a rhythm, a steady beat that gave me a sense of purpose and drive I'd never experienced before. I found myself waking up early, excited to start each day, my mind buzzing with ideas for new products, ways to improve, ways to reach more people. Every order felt like a small affirmation, a reminder that what I was building mattered, that I mattered. Word of my little venture began to spread. My shop gained a small following online. Customers started sharing my work on social media, and soon I was receiving messages from strangers who loved what I was doing. I started attending more craft fairs and even booked a few collaborations with local artists. People who saw potential in my work and wanted to support me. It felt surreal, almost dreamlike, to see my creations in the hands of people who valued them. For the first time in my life, I was seen, acknowledged not as a daughter or an extension of someone else, but as an individual with a voice and vision of my own. But with that visibility came a new set of challenges, ones I hadn't anticipated. My business had started as a hobby, a small, manageable project I could handle on my own. But now, as orders grew and the demand increased, I realized that I needed help. I couldn't keep up with everything alone. I needed to think bigger, to treat this like the business it was becoming. I knew I would need resources, more supplies, better equipment, maybe even a small rented workspace so I could produce my orders efficiently. I began searching for funding options, looking into small business grants, loans, anything that would allow me to take my work to the next level without compromising what I'd built. My parents, however, seemed to have other ideas. They'd started calling more frequently, their voices a strange mix of curiosity and something else, something that set me on edge. They'd ask how I was doing, whether my business was keeping me busy, and if I was making any money yet. At first, I tried to dismiss it as mild interest, a way of keeping the conversation going, but the questions became more pointed. They began asking about my finances, my future plans, even hinting that I should consider bringing in some help to manage things. I knew what they meant. They wanted to be involved, to have a hand in something I'd built on my own, and as much as I wanted to believe they were genuinely interested in my success, I couldn't shake the feeling that they saw my business not as my achievement, but as an opportunity. For the first time, they seemed to notice me, to care about what I was doing, and it felt more invasive than supportive. It felt like they were circling, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Then, one evening, my mother called with an offer. "Your father and I have been talking," she said, her tone casual but with an edge that made my skin prickle. "We think it might be time you let us help you with the business. We know you're busy, and we don't want you to get overwhelmed. Besides, we have some experience managing money. Don't you think it would be wise to let us guide you?" I felt a tightness in my chest as she spoke, a sense of dread rising up from somewhere deep. There was no warmth in her voice, no genuine desire to support me. Her words were clinical, calculated, as if she were presenting a business proposal rather than an offer to help her own child. She didn't see this as my dream, my passion. She saw it as an asset, a piece of potential profit she could sink her teeth into. I struggled to find the words, to express the boundaries I felt so fiercely but had never been taught to defend. "Thanks, but I think I'm doing okay," I said, trying to sound firm without tipping into confrontation. "I have a plan in place, and I've been looking into options for expansion on my own. I appreciate the offer, though." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that felt loaded, like the calm before a storm. My mother cleared her throat, her tone sharpening. "We just want what's best for you. Family should support each other. You don't need to do everything alone." I gripped the phone, feeling the words bubbling up, words I'd never dared to say to her before. "I know," I replied carefully, "but I need to do this on my own. This is my business. It's important to me that I keep it that way." The conversation ended soon after, but the tension lingered. I could feel it, an invisible weight pressing down on me, a reminder that my success was no longer just mine. My parents, who had always been indifferent to my dreams, now seemed intent on claiming a piece of them. It was as if, by daring to build something without their approval or involvement, I had crossed an unspoken line. They had spent years shaping me into someone who would fade into the background, someone who would depend on them for validation. And now that I was breaking free, they were grasping for control in any way they could. Over the next few weeks, their calls became more frequent, their questions more invasive. My mother would hint about the importance of trust in the family, while my father would mention how investing in each other was a hallmark of strong bonds. Each conversation felt like an ambush, an attempt to erode my resolve, to convince me that I was in over my head, that I needed them to succeed. They dangled the idea of family support like a carrot. But I knew it came with strings that would tangle around me, pulling me back into a life I'd fought so hard to leave behind. I started to pull away, retreating into my work with a renewed sense of purpose. My business became my sanctuary, the one place where I could be free from their expectations, their attempts at control. I poured myself into every piece I created, every interaction with customers, every decision I made. My business wasn't just a source of income, it was my lifeline, my proof that I could stand on my own. But as the distance between me and my parents grew, so did the tension. I could feel them watching from the sidelines, waiting for me to stumble, to come crawling back for their help. And though I tried to ignore it, there was a part of me that feared they might be right. I was just one person, trying to hold together a growing business with limited resources and experience. There were days when the workload felt overwhelming, when the pressure to succeed weighed heavily on my shoulders. I knew that, in theory, my parents could help lighten the load. But I also knew that accepting their help would mean sacrificing everything I'd worked for: my independence, my sense of self, my freedom. And so, I kept going, fueled by a mixture of determination and defiance. I worked late into the nights, pushing myself to the brink of exhaustion, driven by a need to prove to myself, to my parents, to everyone that I could do this. I could build something of my own, something that wasn't tainted by their influence or approval. Then, one day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my parents, neatly folded in an envelope addressed to me in my mother's careful handwriting. I opened it, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and curiosity. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal-looking document with lines for signatures and legal jargon I didn't fully understand. At the bottom was a note, scrawled in my mother's handwriting: "Just in case you change your mind, we're always here for you." It was a contract to give them partial control of my business, in exchange for financial assistance and family guidance. They'd put it in writing, a formal offer to take over something I'd built with my own two hands. Something that had nothing to do with them. It was as if they'd reduced my passion, my dreams, to a transaction, a deal they expected me to sign without hesitation. I held the paper in my hands, feeling a rush of anger, of betrayal, of something darker and more final than anything I'd felt before. They hadn't come to support me, they'd come to take what I'd built, to strip away the one thing that was truly mine. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back, No middle ground to be found. I put the letter away, my hands shaking, and returned to my work with a new sense of resolve. I would not let them take this from me. I would not let them turn my dreams into a business deal. A family asset they could control. This was my life, my future, and I was done seeking their approval. Whatever happened next, I would face it on my own terms, no matter the cost. The envelope sat on my desk for days, untouched. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, to acknowledge what it represented. It was a contract, but more than that, it was a reminder of everything my parents saw me as a commodity. An asset to be managed. In a moment that should have felt victorious, all I felt was a sinking bitterness. An understanding that my success hadn't earned their respect, only their interest. They didn't want to support me. They wanted to stake their claim on something that wasn't theirs. But as the days passed, I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. I had to respond, to send a message that would make it clear where I stood. So, I sat down and wrote a short note, measured and polite, declining their offer and explaining that I needed to keep my business independent. I wrote that while I appreciated their support, I had my own path, and I needed to follow it without interference. It was a letter of boundaries, a line in the sand. I mailed it, hoping that it would end there. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. A week passed before I heard from them. My mother called first, her tone a careful blend of concern and exasperation. "You know, we only want to help," she said, her voice edging toward a lecture. "We've been in the world a lot longer than you have, and we know how hard it is to run a business. You don't have to struggle alone. Family is supposed to help each other." I took a breath, my hand gripping the phone tightly. "I know, Mom, but this is something I have to do on my own. I've worked hard to get here, and I want to keep it that way." There was a pause, a silence that stretched out like a taut wire, vibrating with tension. I could almost picture her on the other end, eyes narrowing, calculating her next words. "You know, pride can be a dangerous thing," she said finally. "It's good to be independent, but it's also wise to accept help when you need it. Don't make this harder on yourself than it needs to be." Her words landed like small blows, each one designed to chip away at my confidence. But I knew I couldn't let them reach me. I'd come too far, built too much to let her doubt creep back into my life. I thanked her for the offer once more, kept my tone light, and ended the call as quickly as I could. My heart was pounding, a mix of anger and frustration boiling just beneath the surface. It was clear that my polite refusal hadn't gotten through. They weren't going to let this go. After that, the calls became more frequent, and each one carried a subtle layer of manipulation, a reminder of what they could offer if only I would let them in. My father started chiming in too, his voice quiet but insistent, reminding me of all the missed opportunities people face because they're too proud to accept help. They painted a picture of me as reckless, as though my decision to keep my business to myself was some naive act of rebellion rather than a carefully considered choice. One day, my mother even tried a new tactic, one that sent a chill through me. "We're worried about you, you know," she said, her tone laced with a softness that felt foreign. "You're working so hard, burning the candle at both ends. We just want to make sure you're not overworking yourself. Stress can be so damaging, and family is here to help with that." For a moment, I almost believed her. It was a vulnerable spot in me, a small, quiet fear I hadn't let myself acknowledge, the fear that I was, in fact, taking on too much, that maybe I couldn't handle the weight of it all on my own. But then I caught myself, reminding myself that this wasn't a lifeline being thrown out of love. It was a hook, baited with concern but meant to pull me back under their influence. They weren't reaching out to support me, they were reaching out to control me. And as their efforts became more insistent, I realized that I couldn't keep engaging with them the way I always had. I had to make a change. I had to draw a line so firm that even they couldn't cross it. I had to protect what I'd built, to shield my future from the grasp. So I made a decision, one that felt both liberating and terrifying. I stopped answering their calls. I stopped responding to their emails, their letters, their messages. I knew that it would spark anger, confusion, that they would feel slighted and wronged. But it was the only way. I couldn't keep explaining myself, couldn't keep justifying my choices. They would never see my business for what it truly was to me, a lifeline, a piece of my heart. To them, it would always be a means to an end, something they could use to their advantage. The silence stretched out between us, thick and uncomfortable. Days turned into weeks, then months. I threw myself into my work, focusing on growing my business, expanding my product line, connecting with customers who appreciated what I was creating. And in that silence, I found a kind of peace. I no longer felt the weight of their expectations, the need to answer their probing questions or fend off their manipulation. I was finally free to move forward without the anchor of their judgment holding me back. But freedom came with its own challenges. The work was harder than ever. The pressures more intense. There were moments when I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. One misstep away from losing everything I'd worked so hard to build. But every time I felt that fear creeping in, I reminded myself of why I was doing this, of the life I wanted to create on my own terms. I wasn't just building a business, I was building a future, a life that was mine and mine alone. And then, just when I thought I'd finally escaped the grasp, the letters started arriving. They were formal, stiffly worded letters with an official-looking seal, each one stamped with my parents' return address. They came in waves, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single week, each one carefully folded and sealed, a calculated reminder of their persistence. I opened the first one cautiously, my hands shaking as I unfolded the crisp paper. Inside was a letter from my parents' lawyer. It was filled with legal jargon, phrases about family obligations and mutual benefit, and a veiled suggestion that they had a right to be involved in my business decisions, given their role as my primary guardians and caretakers. It was a threat, thinly disguised as a plea for family unity. The words blurred before my eyes, and I felt a wave of anger and disbelief rise within me. They hadn't just crossed the line, they'd erased it altogether, forcing their way into my life in a way I'd never expected. This wasn't about love, or care, or even family. This was about control. They couldn't bear to see me succeed without them, couldn't stand the idea of me thriving without their hand in every decision. I sat down and wrote a response, my hands shaking as I poured out everything I'd held back for years. I told them, plainly and without hesitation, that they were no longer welcome in my life, that I would not tolerate their interference in my business or my future. I told them that I was done playing the game, done bending to their will, done pretending that their interest in my life was anything but self-serving. I mailed the letter the next day, feeling a strange mix of relief and finality. I knew this would sever our ties, that they would see this as an act of betrayal, of defiance. But I also knew that it was the only way forward. I couldn't build my life with them hovering in the shadows, waiting to pounce on every success, to claim every achievement as their own. And as the days passed, I felt the weight lifting. My business flourished, each new success a quiet victory, a reminder that I could stand on my own. My parents' letters stopped coming. Their calls went silent, and in that silence, I found a kind of peace I hadn't known was possible. I had broken free, not just from their control, but from the hold they'd had over me all my life. I was finally living for myself, building something that was truly mine, and for the first time, I felt whole, complete, as if I'd finally reclaimed the parts of myself that had been lost in their shadow. And I knew, deep down, that whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the strength I'd found in that silence. I was no longer the daughter who craved their love or approval. I was my own person, free to forge a future that was mine and mine alone. I thought the silence would last forever, that my final letter would serve as a clear signal to my parents, a declaration that I had taken control of my life and that there was no longer room for them to meddle. For a while, it worked. My days were filled with purpose, a steady rhythm of creativity and ambition that kept me grounded. Moving forward, I felt untethered, free, as if I had finally escaped the weight of their shadow. But freedom is a delicate thing, easily disrupted, and it wasn't long before my parents found a way to intrude, breaking through the boundaries I'd so carefully constructed. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a knock on my apartment door one rainy evening. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when I peered through the peephole and saw my mother standing there, clutching a folder under her arm, my heart plummeted. I hadn't seen her in over a year. Her face looked older, more severe, but her eyes held the same cold determination I remembered all too well. Reluctantly, I opened the door, bracing myself for whatever she had come to say. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She stepped inside uninvited, her expression steely as she held out the folder, her hand trembling slightly. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight. I didn't invite her to sit down. I took the folder, opened it, and my stomach twisted as I scanned the contents. Inside were bank statements, legal documents, and something that made my skin go cold, a set of financial projections for my business. Somehow, my parents had managed to gain access to my business's finances, to analyze and scrutinize my earnings, my expenses, even my growth plans. They had been tracking my success without my knowledge, dissecting my work as if it were their own. I looked up at her, anger and disbelief simmering just beneath the surface. "How did you get these?" My voice was barely a whisper, but each word carried the weight of my shock and betrayal. My mother didn't flinch. "We have our ways," she replied coldly, "and we've been watching. You've done well, we'll give you that, but you're making some critical mistakes. If you're not careful, this whole thing is going to come crashing down. That's why we're here to offer our guidance before it's too late. Guidance, I echoed, struggling to keep my composure. This is my business. You had no right to. Oh, we have every right, she interrupted, her voice dripping with authority. We're your family. You wouldn't be where you are today if it weren't for the foundation we provided. You owe us, whether you want to admit it or not. Those words hit me like a slap. In their eyes, my success was not my own, it was something they had a claim to. A right over, simply because of their role as my parents. The years of distance, the boundaries I'd tried to establish, the hard work I'd poured into building something of my own, they didn't see any of it. All they saw was an opportunity to take control, to insert themselves into my life in the one place they knew would hurt the most. I took a step back, clutching the folder in my hands. I wanted to shout, to scream, to throw them out of my life once and for all. But I knew that they thrived on confrontation, on exploiting moments of weakness. I steadied my breathing, forcing myself to remain calm. Please leave, I said quietly, refusing to look her in the eye. This is my life, my business, and I don't need your help. For a moment, my mother simply stood there, her expression unreadable, but then she took a step forward, her face softening in a way that felt almost unnatural. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice laced with a false gentleness. We're only trying to protect you. You're not thinking clearly, you're blinded by pride. Don't let that ruin everything you've worked for. I could feel the anger bubbling up again, but I pushed it down, refusing to give her the satisfaction. I appreciate your concern, I replied, my voice steady but laced with steel. But I don't want or need your protection. You've done enough. I opened the door, gesturing for her to leave. She hesitated, her expression shifting from anger to something that almost resembled disappointment. But I didn't care anymore. I was done. I had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let them steal this part of my life from me. Finally, she stepped outside, turning to look at me one last time before walking away, her back straight and unyielding. I closed the door, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion settle over me. I had stood my ground, but I knew that this was far from over. My parents didn't accept defeat easily. If anything, this confrontation would only fuel their determination to regain control. In the days that followed, I felt a lingering sense of dread, a constant tension that made it hard to focus on my work. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the next move in what had become a twisted game of power and control. And sure enough, the next blow came swiftly, and this time it was even more insidious. I received a letter from my bank, informing me of a family inquiry that had been made regarding my accounts. Apparently, my parents had attempted to gain access to my business finances, using a claim of family guardianship to justify their request. They hadn't succeeded. Of course, the bank had denied them access, but the very fact that they had tried was enough to shake me to my core. They were relentless, willing to cross any line, break any boundary, to assert their control. It was as if they couldn't bear the thought of me thriving without them, of me standing on my own 2 feet. They had spent years shaping me into someone who would depend on them, who would seek their approval. And now that I had broken free, they were determined to pull me back, to remind me of their power. But I wasn't the same person I had once been. I had tasted freedom, independence, and I knew that I couldn't go back, no matter the cost. I was done playing the games, done allowing them to manipulate me with guilt and obligation. I was going to fight for my business, for my life, for the future I had built with my own hands. I took action. I hired a lawyer, someone who specialized in family business disputes and financial independence. I laid out everything: my parents' interference, their attempts to access my finances, their unrelenting pressure. I knew that I was risking everything, that my parents would see this as a betrayal, an unforgivable act of defiance. But I didn't care anymore. I was willing to do whatever it took to protect what I had built. The legal battle was exhausting. My parents fought back, accusing me of ingratitude, of abandoning family values. They portrayed themselves as victims, parents who had only ever tried to help their wayward child. They painted a picture of me as reckless, ungrateful, incapable of managing my own affairs. They tried to use my own history against me, dredging up every mistake, every misstep I had ever made, as if those moments defined me, as if I was still the child they had tried so hard to control. But I stood firm. My lawyer was thorough, unyielding, and we dismantled their arguments piece by piece, exposing the manipulation, the control, the ways they had tried to insert themselves into my life under the guise of family support. It was a long, grueling process, but with each passing day, I felt a little bit stronger, a little more certain of my own worth. Finally, the day came when the judge ruled in my favor. The court recognized my right to autonomy, to control my own business and finances without interference. It was a victory, a validation of everything I had fought for. My parents were furious, of course, their faces hard and unforgiving as they left the courtroom. They didn't say a word to me, didn't even look my way, but I felt their anger, their disappointment, as if it were a tangible force. As I left the courthouse, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I had won not just in the legal sense, but in a much deeper, more personal way. I had reclaimed my life, my future, and I knew that I would never have to live in their shadow again. I was free, truly free, to build the life I wanted, to pursue my dreams without fear of interference or control. And in that moment, I realized something that had eluded me for years. I didn't need their love, their approval, their validation. I had found my own worth, my own strength, and that was enough. I was enough. I had always been enough. I returned to my work with a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet confidence that couldn't be shaken. My business flourished, growing beyond anything I had ever imagined, and I built a life filled with meaning, with joy, with people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them. My parents were no longer a part of that life, but I had made peace with that. I had given them enough of myself, and now it was time to live for me. And as the years passed, I looked back on that chapter of my life with a sense of gratitude. Not for the pain or the struggle, but for the strength it had forged within me. I had survived, thrived, despite everything they had tried to take from me. And in the end, I had won. My life was mine, fully and completely, and I knew that no one would ever take that from me again. The legal battle had taken its toll on me. I felt relief. Yes, a deep, profound relief that went all the way down to my bones. I was free from the grasp. Truly free, and that knowledge buoyed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. But there was also an exhaustion, a lingering fatigue that reminded me just how much I had given, how much I had sacrificed, to break free from their control. In the weeks that followed, I turned inward. I stopped attending events, took a step back from the social circles I had so carefully built, and spent most of my time alone. I'd pour myself into my work in the quiet hours of the early morning, wrapping up orders, designing new products, creating in solitude. But even as my hands were busy, my mind was always somewhere else, revisiting memories I had tried so hard to bury. It was as though the entire ordeal had unearthed fragments of my past that I hadn't fully reckoned with. Memories of hurt and neglect that I needed to confront. Eventually, I realized that I couldn't keep pushing those feelings down. I had to face them, to finally understand why I had allowed my parents' influence to haunt me for so long. Why had I spent years craving their love, their approval, only to be met with indifference and manipulation? Why had I sacrificed so much of myself in the hope that one day they would see me for who I was? That they would finally acknowledge my worth? Seeking clarity, I decided to reach out to a therapist, someone who could help me navigate these tangled emotions. I needed to make sense of the parts of myself that I had hidden away, the parts that still hurt even after I had won my freedom. The first few sessions were difficult, talking about my parents, about the years of neglect and the painful realization that they had never truly loved me. Felt like peeling back layers of scar tissue, but each conversation brought a new understanding, a deeper awareness of the wounds I carried and the ways they had shaped me. I came to see that, for most of my life, I had defined my worth through their eyes. I had allowed their judgment, their expectations, to dictate who I was and who I could be. In my desire to please them, to earn their love, I had silenced my own voice, dimmed my own light, convinced myself that I was not enough. It was a painful truth, but one that also brought a strange sense of liberation. Recognizing the roots of my pain allowed me to begin the process of healing, of rebuilding myself from the inside out. In those therapy sessions, I learned the importance of boundaries, true boundaries that went beyond polite refusals and vague limitations. Boundaries that allowed me to protect my heart, to nurture my own needs without guilt or shame. It was a slow, gradual process, but each step forward brought me closer to a version of myself that I had never known before. A version of myself that was whole, complete, independent of anyone else's expectations or approval. And as I learned to honor my own boundaries, I found myself growing stronger, more resilient. My business became a reflection of that resilience. Each piece I created carrying a part of my journey, a testament to the strength I had found within myself. Customers would often reach out to tell me how much they connected with my work, how they felt an unexpected sense of connection when they held one of my creations. And every time I read those messages, I felt a sense of pride that went beyond financial success. I was building something meaningful, something that touched others in ways I hadn't anticipated. But even as I embraced this new chapter of my life, there were still moments of lingering doubt. echoes of my parents' voices that would creep in during moments of vulnerability. I would catch myself second-guessing decisions, wondering if I was truly capable of navigating this path on my own. But each time those doubts surfaced, I reminded myself of everything I had overcome, of the battles I had fought to get here. I was no longer that uncertain, timid person, waiting for someone else's permission to pursue her dreams. I was my own person now, fully and unapologetically. Then, one evening, months after the legal battle had ended, I received a letter from my mother. It was unexpected, an intrusion into the peace I had worked so hard to build. For a moment, I considered throwing it away, refusing to let her words disturb my hard-won tranquility. But something made me open it, a quiet curiosity that I couldn't quite ignore. The letter was short, written in her neat, precise handwriting. She wrote that she had accepted the court's decision, that she and my father would no longer interfere with my business. She acknowledged, in a brief, detached way, that they had misjudged me, that they had acted out of a desire to protect the family. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a cold, factual acknowledgement of the distance that now existed between us. But at the end, there was one sentence that caught me off guard, a sentence that felt strangely out of place in an otherwise emotionless letter. "We hope you find happiness," she had written, "even if it's without us." I stared at those words, reading them over and over, trying to make sense of them. They didn't feel like an apology, nor did they feel like a genuine expression of love. They felt more like a resignation, an acceptance that they had lost control over me and that they would no longer be a part of my life. And as I read those words, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. In that moment, I realized that I would never have the relationship with them that I had once dreamed of. I would never have the kind of family that showed up with open arms, with unconditional love. I would never hear the words, "I'm proud of you," or "I love you," from them. And I would never see in their eyes the acceptance I had spent so many years yearning for. But I also realized that I didn't need those things. I didn't need their validation, their approval, or even their love. I had found those things within myself, within the life I had built, within the people who had become my chosen family, my true support system. I had found happiness, not in spite of them but beyond them, in a world that was entirely my own. With a sense of finality, I folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer, not out of sentiment but out of closure. It was a reminder of the journey I had taken, of the battles I had fought to arrive at this place of peace and self-acceptance. I didn't need their love to be complete. I had found wholeness within myself. In the months that followed, my life continued to flourish. My business grew, my friendships deepened, and I found myself surrounded by people who saw me for who I truly was. People who loved and supported me without conditions or demands. I embraced the life I had built, a life that was vibrant and fulfilling, filled with moments of joy and gratitude that I had once thought were out of reach. And as the years went by, I looked back on my journey with a sense of pride, not for the success I had achieved but for the person I had become. I had transformed my pain into strength, my struggles into resilience, and in doing so, I had created a life that was truly, beautifully my own. In the end, I found happiness, not the kind of happiness that comes from external validation or approval, but a deeper, more enduring kind of joy, a joy that came from knowing that I had fought for myself, that I had carved out a place in the world that was uniquely mine. And that was enough. It was more than enough. I had finally found peace, not in the love I had once sought from others but in the love I had found within myself. And as I looked forward to the future, I knew that I was ready for whatever it held, unafraid, unbound, and fully, unapologetically free. In the months that followed, my life settled into a quiet rhythm, one that felt as natural as breathing. I threw myself into my work, expanding my business with a focus and drive that felt more authentic than ever. Each day brought a renewed sense of purpose, a freedom that came from knowing I was finally living on my own terms. My business became more than just a source of income. It was a living, breathing testament to everything I had overcome. It was my proof to the world, and perhaps more importantly, to myself, that I was capable, resilient, and worthy. With each new project, I pushed myself creatively, taking risks that I'd once been too afraid to try. I embraced the challenges that came my way, finding joy not just in the success but in the growth, the process, the sense of discovery. Along the way, my business began to attract attention. Opportunities arose that I had never imagined: press features, invitations to showcase my work, collaborations with artists and creators I had once admired from afar. Every new milestone was a reminder that I had made the right choice, that I had carved a path for myself that was entirely mine. And with each success, I felt the weight of my past grow lighter, as though I were shedding old layers. unburdening myself from years of self-doubt and dependence. Yet, even with all of this growth, there were still quiet moments of vulnerability, moments when the old voices crept in, whispering doubts and insecurities that I had thought I'd left behind. I had come to understand that healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey. A process of learning to trust myself and let go of the patterns that no longer served me. And in those moments of doubt, I reminded myself of everything I had built, of the battles I had fought and won. I reminded myself that I was no longer defined by anyone else's expectations or limitations. Then, one evening, as I was closing my shop for the night, I received an email that took me by surprise. It was from a small organization that worked with young entrepreneurs, specifically those who had faced adversity in their personal lives. They wanted to feature my story, to share my journey as an example of resilience and determination. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to share the more painful parts of my story with the world. But as I thought it over, I realized that this was an opportunity to take ownership of my past, to reclaim my story on my own terms. I accepted the invitation, and a few weeks later, I found myself sitting in a small, brightly lit studio, speaking with an interviewer who asked thoughtful, compassionate questions about my journey. For the first time, I spoke openly about my parents, about the challenges I had faced, about the long road I had traveled to arrive at this place of peace and self-trust. As I spoke, I felt a strange sense of release, as though I was shedding the last remnants of the pain I had carried for so long. Sharing my story felt like an act of liberation, a way of honoring the person I had become. The interview was published soon after, and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people who had faced similar struggles, who had fought their own battles for independence and self-worth. Some shared their own stories of estrangement, of finding peace in solitude, of learning to love themselves without the approval of others. Others thanked me for my honesty, for showing them that it was possible to create a life that was meaningful and fulfilling, even without the support of family. Reading those messages brought tears to my eyes. I had never imagined that my story could touch others, that my journey could inspire someone else to find their own strength. For so long, I had seen myself as someone who had simply endured, who had survived in spite of the odds. But now, I saw myself through a new lens as someone who had taken that pain and transformed it into something beautiful. Something that had the power to uplift and inspire others. With each passing day, I felt more grounded, more certain of my place in the world. My business continued to thrive, fueled not just by my own determination but by the support and encouragement of the people who believed in me. I had built a community, a network of friends and mentors who lifted me up, who saw me for who I truly was and valued me without conditions or expectations. One afternoon, as I was working on a new project, I received a call from an old friend from high school. We hadn't spoken in years, but she had seen the interview and reached out to reconnect. We talked for hours, reminiscing about the past, sharing stories of where life had taken us. She told me that she had always admired my resilience, that even in high school, she could see that I was someone who was meant to do great things. Her words touched me in a way I hadn't expected, a reminder of the quiet strength that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Over time, I reconnected with a few more people from my past, friends and acquaintances who had once been part of my life but had drifted away as I struggled to find my own path. These reconnections felt like small gifts, reminders of the support I had always had, even when I hadn't been able to see it. And as I welcomed these people back into my life, I found myself healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was no longer alone. I had built a life that was rich with connection, with friendship, with love. Then, one evening, as I was closing up shop, I received a text message that made me pause. It was from my mother, short and simple, asking if we could meet for coffee. For a moment, I felt a pang of uncertainty, a flicker of the old anxiety that had once accompanied every interaction with her. But then I took a deep breath, grounding myself in the strength I had found, the boundaries I had built. I knew that I had changed, that I was no longer the person who had once craved her approval, her validation. I had no illusions that this meeting would change our relationship, or that it would bring the reconciliation I had once longed for. But I also knew that I was strong enough to face her, to hear whatever she had to say, and to walk away with my peace intact. The next day, I met her at a small cafe, arriving early to find a seat by the window. She entered a few minutes later, her face drawn and tired, but her expression soft, almost hesitant. She sat down across from me, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other, two people who had once been family but had become strangers. She spoke first, her voice quiet. She didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge the pain or the betrayal, but she did offer a few words of acknowledgement, a vague attempt to explain her actions. to justify the choices she had made. I listened, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as though I were watching the scene unfold from a distance. Her words no longer had the power to wound me, no longer held the weight they once had. When she finished, I took a deep breath and told her my truth. I told her about the years of hurt, the boundaries I had set, the life I had built in spite of everything. I told her that I had found peace, that I had created a life filled with love and joy, a life that was whole without her in it. I told her that I wished her well, that I hoped she found her own path to happiness, but that I could no longer allow her into my life on her terms. She nodded, her expression unreadable, and we parted ways without fanfare or sentiment. There were no tears, no dramatic goodbyes, just a quiet understanding that we had reached the end of our journey together. As I walked away, I felt a profound sense of closure, a lightness that filled every corner of my being. I had faced her, spoken my truth, and walked away with my peace intact. In the months that followed, I found myself filled with a sense of gratitude for the life I had built, for the strength I had found in the face of adversity. My business continued to thrive, my friendships deepened, and my days were filled with moments of joy, of laughter, of connection. I had created a life that was rich, vibrant, and meaningful, a life that was truly my own. And as I looked toward the future, I felt a quiet certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the strength and resilience I had found within myself. I was no longer defined by my past, no longer bound by the need for approval or validation. I had found my own worth, my own happiness, and I knew, deep in my soul, that I was enough. In the end, my story was not one of loss or estrangement, but of transformation. I had taken the pain, the struggle, the heartache, and turned it into something beautiful, something enduring. I had built a life that was filled with love, with purpose, with freedom, and as I looked back on the journey that had brought me here, I felt a deep, abiding gratitude for the lessons, for the growth, and for the knowledge that I was, and always had been, whole. This was my life, my story, and I was finally, truly free.